The fourth largest producer of oil and gas in the world, Canada exports 97% of its resource to the U.S. 60% of oil and gas that goes into the United States comes from Canada.
Donald Trump says he wants to protect American energy, but what if he's quietly weakening the very foundation of it? At a time when energy security is more important than ever, the U.S. still relies heavily on imported oil, and most of that oil, about 2/3, comes from one place, Canada. Yet Trump's own trade policies are threatening to disrupt that flow. How did we get here, where the United States needs Canadian oil more than ever, but Trump's strategy is pushing it away?
It seems not very exposed because it's the one thing the U.S. hasn't really put any tariffs on so far. I think they recognize they need our oil and gas to provide energy security for their country, and that if they tried to put a tariff on it, they'd still have to buy it. It would just mean higher consumer prices.
Canada supplies between 50% and 70% of all U.S. oil imports, averaging around 4 million barrels per day, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. This isn't just about volume. Canadian crude is uniquely suited for American refineries, especially those in the Midwest, which were built to process heavier oil grades, exactly what Canada produces. And unlike oil from OPEC nations, Russia, or Iran, Canadian energy comes from a stable, democratic neighbor. It's not subject to sanctions, political manipulation, or military conflict. Washington knows this. That's why, even as Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and manufactured goods, he kept oil mostly exempt, for now.
The refineries will have to jack up prices if tariffs go on that oil. It could be 50 or 75 cents a barrel, and particularly the Midwest refineries in Minnesota and Illinois and some of those swing states.
But that exemption doesn't mean safety. Trump's trade doctrine is built on threats and uncertainty. As part of his hardline America First push, he's warning of 35% tariffs on all Canadian exports, oil included, if Canada refuses to sign a new bilateral deal. Currently, Canadian oil faces only a 10% tariff, but repeated threats of escalation have already shaken investor confidence. When companies can't predict tax levels or border access, they stop planning for long-term growth. According to ARC Energy Research Institute, total investment in Canadian oil and gas for 2025 is down 25% compared to the average of the previous 3 years. That means fewer drilling projects, fewer pipeline expansions, and no increase in supply to meet U.S. demand.
In Ukraine. So there's just so much uncertainty right now that for investors and for companies, it's very difficult to try to decide, are we going to, drill more wells, or are we just going to let it ride the way it is?
That slowdown is already hitting infrastructure. Canada's biggest export pipeline, Trans Mountain, is running near capacity. Major pipeline proposals like Energy East were canceled years ago, and with political risk and cost inflation on the rise, new projects remain stalled. To compensate, Canada is trying to boost output through short-term upgrades, but those are band-aids, not solutions. This bottleneck makes the U.S. energy system more fragile. A single disruption, whether from maintenance, weather, or sabotage, could tighten supply, spike fuel prices, and put refiners in a bind. Instead of shoring up a critical source of energy, Trump's policies are injecting risk, the opposite of energy independence. Facing pressure, Canada isn't backing down. Prime Minister Mark Carney has taken a firm stance. Canada won't sign a bad deal just to dodge tariffs. Carney understands the leverage. Trump can threaten, but he can't afford to lose Canadian oil. That's why Ottawa is buying time, holding the line, investing in domestic resilience, and reforming its energy sector to attract long-term capital again. At the same time, Canada is diversifying its trade partners, strengthening supply chains with Europe and Asia to avoid over-reliance on the U.S. market. Rather than panic, Canada is playing a longer, steadier game. Trump believes tariffs force countries to fold, but with Canada, his tactics are backfiring. He hasn't pushed Canada into a deal. Instead, he's triggered a pullback in energy investment, weakening a cornerstone of America's fuel supply. The irony is stark. In trying to make America stronger, Trump may be making its energy future more vulnerable. So the real question is, how can you win a trade war if your own energy supply is the first casualty?
U.S. President Donald Trump says he has struck his biggest trade deal yet, and he's agreed to a trade framework with the European Union.
We've reached a deal. It's a good deal for everybody, I believe.
The United States and the European Union have agreed to a new trade framework. At the center of it, a 15% blanket tariff on most European goods entering the US pharmaceuticals are exempt. But steel and aluminum from the EU will still face the steep 50% tariff imposed under national security provisions. In exchange, the EU committed to $750 billion worth of energy purchases from the United States and pledged $600 billion in new investments. They also agreed to significant defense procurement, although no figures were disclosed. This deal is not a binding treaty. It's a framework, announced just days before a 30% tariff was set to take effect. That timing wasn't accidental. It followed the same pattern we've seen in other Trump-era negotiations: pressure, then deal.
$750 billion worth of energy. To agree to invest into the United States $600 billion.
It's 15% tariffs across the board, all inclusive. The investments Mr. President just described, and the purchases over there. Indeed, basically the European market is open. It's 450 million people.
This isn't a one-off. We've already seen similar structures in deals with Japan, the United Kingdom, and Vietnam. In each case, Trump threatened steep tariffs. Then, after days or weeks of speculation, a framework was announced, usually built around a 15% baseline tariff and large-scale investment or procurement from the foreign side. This model flips the trade conversation. It's not about removing barriers. It's about creating predictability and charging for it. Trump's 15% now feels moderate, simply because the alternative he threatens is always worse. That's not trade liberalization. It's transactional stability. And the pattern is clear. Allies, competitors, everyone pays. Now, all eyes turn to Canada. A 35% tariff is scheduled to take effect on August 1st if no deal is reached. Ottawa has made it clear. The deadline is political, not legal. And they won't be rushed into a bad agreement. But the EU and Japan were longtime US allies too, and both had to accept Trump's terms. Canada knows that. And while it hasn't signed any framework, it's not sitting idle. Canada brings leverage to the table. Over $1 trillion in investment into the US, a deeply integrated energy and auto supply chain, and decades of cross-border ties with key American states. Alberta's oil, Ontario's parts plants, these aren't abstract advantages. They're real points of influence. Carney's government is watching the sequence, not resisting it. The strategy isn't to be first, it's to be smart. The federal government has already moved to manage public expectations. Early promises of a good deal have shifted into a more realistic message. This will be about managing trade-offs. The lessons are clear. No country has secured full exemptions. Baseline tariffs are now the floor. And rushing into a vague framework, like what Japan and the EU accepted, might avoid pain in the short term, but lead to problems later. Instead, Ottawa is preparing, working with provinces, identifying sectors that need shielding, and exploring room for targeted offsets. Trade diplomacy is still happening, just not on Trump's schedule. Trump's trade system isn't built on trust. It's built on leverage and price tags. But that doesn't mean Canada has to fold. It means Canada has to design, shape a deal that protects what matters most, whether that's auto, energy, or digital trade. The real danger isn't delay, it's giving in too early for too little. In this new world, the countries that hesitate might get hit. But the countries that rush, they might get locked into terms they regret. And Carney knows, better to sign the right deal late than the wrong deal too soon.
U.S. President Donald Trump showing no signs of backing down from his tariff agenda as old complaints about Canada surface again, adding to the already tense relationship. Still, the Trump administration insists this is not the end of free trade with its neighbors.
When U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said that free trade with Canada is still possible, many were surprised. After months of tariff threats, some reaching 35%, the tone suddenly seemed less absolute. But the question isn't whether Trump changed his mind. It's why. Something clearly shifted behind closed doors. Because even as Trump keeps the pressure high, Ottawa may be holding a card that Washington can't afford to lose. That card: Canada's role in energy, and more specifically, uranium.
The largest uranium mine comes out of Saskatchewan, comes over to Ontario, and then gets enriched down in the U.S.
Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft are all betting on nuclear energy to power their AI data center.
From California to Virginia, tech giants like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft are expanding massive data centers. And all of them have one thing in common: they demand enormous amounts of electricity, clean, constant, and carbon-free. Nuclear power, once overlooked, is now back in the spotlight. And uranium, its essential fuel, is in short supply. The U.S. has tried to revive domestic uranium production. In 2024, the U.S. mined only 676,939 pounds, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That's less than 1.5% of the roughly 48 million pounds America currently needs each year. And the gap is only growing. Trump's own executive orders target 190 million pounds per year by 2050 as nuclear power quadruples to meet energy demand. But there's a problem. America now imports over 95% of its uranium. And the infrastructure for enrichment and processing is still dominated by Russia and China, two geopolitical rivals. That's why Canada's uranium supply is vital. The Cigar Lake mine in Saskatchewan, operated by Cameco, produces 11% of global uranium demand, and a significant, though undisclosed, portion heads directly into the U.S. nuclear fuel cycle. If Canada brings that leverage to the negotiating table, it could change everything. And uranium is just the beginning. Because beyond nuclear fuel, Canada also powers America through oil, gas, and electricity, resources equally hard to replace. Canada isn't just waiting for Trump's phone call, it's already shifting its energy exports away from the U.S. In July 2025, Canada shipped its first liquefied natural gas, LNG cargo, to South Korea from the massive LNG Canada terminal in British Columbia. With more LNG projects under development, like Cedar LNG and Woodfibre LNG, Canada is building new energy corridors to Asia. Meanwhile, uranium exports to the European Union are surging. France's EDF signed long-term contracts for Canadian uranium to help reduce EU dependence on Russian energy. And in this broader strategy, Trump's tariffs have ironically accelerated Canada's diversification. By turning to Asia and Europe, Ottawa has reduced its reliance on American buyers and increased its leverage in return. Of course, the US has other energy suppliers. Australia, for example, ships uranium to American utilities. But even that relationship is under strain. Trade tensions, especially over pharmaceutical pricing and rare earths, have begun to affect broader economic ties. Other past suppliers, like Russia and Belarus, are either sanctioned or politically untenable. What's left is a short list, and Canada is at the top. Not just for uranium, but also for nickel, aluminum, auto parts, and crude oil. Ontario alone holds the world's most accessible reserves of high-grade nickel, which is critical for electric vehicles, defense systems, and AI servers. With supply chains so closely tied, the message is hard to miss. The two economies are simply too integrated to pull apart.
Donald Trump has announced that he wants a golden age for the American economy. That means they're going to need more energy, more minerals, more steel and aluminum, more lumber, more concrete, more of the things that Canada is already sending them.
Uranium, and energy more broadly, isn't just a Canadian export, it's leverage. In a negotiation driven by tariffs and tension, it might be the key to securing a deal with Trump. That's why, despite all the pressure and posturing, a partial deal before August 1st remains on the table. Canada may agree to some targeted tariffs on autos or steel, but only if its core energy exports remain protected. Because in the end, this isn't just a trade fight. It's a test of how two deeply linked economies find balance in an era of brinkmanship.